In the spring of 1803, the United States government announced that it had purchased approximately 828,000 square miles of North American territory from the French Republic. The price, according to the official account, was $15 million. Thomas Jefferson called it the most noble work of our whole lives. American schoolbooks have repeated the same version of this story for 2 centuries. A young republic seized a generational opportunity, doubled its size overnight, and set the course for continental dominance through a combination of diplomatic boldness, fortunate timing, and presidential willingness to act when history demanded it. James Monroe and Robert Livingston are remembered as the diplomats who secured the deal. Napoleon is remembered as the emperor who, facing military and logistical reality, sold what he could no longer defend. Jefferson is remembered as the statesman who overcame his own constitutional scruples when the moment required it, and the price was agreed. The transaction appears in the standard account as a triumph of American agency: 2 governments, 2 sets of negotiators, and a price that represented extraordinary value for a nation just beginning to understand the scale of the continent it occupied. If this record has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. The geography of who is paying attention to this matters. That account is not false. It is incomplete in a way that fundamentally changes the meaning of what occurred. The standard narrative presents the Louisiana Purchase as a transaction between 2 governments, negotiated by their representatives and settled at the agreed price. What the financial record shows is that neither government controlled the mechanism through which the transaction was possible, that the price inscribed in the treaty was not the actual cost paid by the United States, and that the private institutions which made the exchange financially executable extracted a return that appears in no conventional telling of the story. The $15 million that changed the map of North America did not move the way the history books describe. It did not travel from the United States Treasury to the French Republic. It could not have. The United States did not have $15 million. What it had was the authority to issue bonds, and what it needed was a buyer for those bonds willing to deliver cash to France on terms Napoleon's treasury could deploy immediately for a war that was about to resume. That buyer was already identified before the American negotiators in Paris had completed reading the final treaty clauses. The money reached Napoleon's war chest. The territory reached the United States. The profit, compounded across 15 years of interest payments drawn from American tax receipts, went to a private banking house in London and another in Amsterdam, whose involvement in the transaction the political history of the Louisiana Purchase has never treated as part of the central account. To understand what the financial record shows, it is necessary to establish what the United States actually was in 1803, not in terms of its ambitions or its territorial aspirations, but in terms of its balance sheet. The Republic was 27 years old. Its national credit in European capital markets was uncertain, and its institutional track record short. The continental currency issued during the Revolution had collapsed entirely, becoming a synonym for worthlessness in common speech. The phrase, "not worth a continental," had entered the American vernacular as shorthand for anything without value. The federal government under the Constitution had been functioning for only 14 years, and its financial apparatus remained thin. Its revenue base was narrow, dependent primarily on customs duties collected at the principal eastern ports. Its treasury held nothing close to the sum required to complete the transaction Jefferson had authorized his negotiators to pursue. The federal government's total annual revenue in 1802 was approximately $10 million. $15 million in specie was not a transaction the United States could execute from its own resources under any arrangement then available to it. The Bank of the United States, the Hamiltonian institution that Jefferson had spent years opposing and whose rechartering his political allies would refuse in 1811, held insufficient specie reserves to underwrite a land purchase of this scale. The customs receipts that constituted the primary revenue of the federal government could not be mobilized on a timeline that matched Napoleon's requirements for immediate war funding. The United States had no mechanism of its own to convert a political decision to buy into a cash payment to France. Everyone involved in the transaction understood this from the beginning, which means the Louisiana Purchase was, from its first negotiated moment, a credit instrument. The political question was whether to buy. The financial question, which the diplomatic history has consistently treated as a secondary matter handled by subordinate officials after the main terms were agreed, was who would supply the money, on what terms, and what claim they would hold on the United States government across the life of the resulting debt. That question was not resolved in Washington or in Paris. It was resolved in London and Amsterdam by institutions that had been positioning themselves to answer it before the American negotiators departed for France. The diplomatic record is well known. Robert Livingston had been instructed by Jefferson to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and potentially the Floridas, not the entire Louisiana Territory. The city of New Orleans controlled the passage of American agricultural goods from the western interior to the Atlantic and Caribbean markets. The produce of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the settlements of the Ohio Valley moved down the Mississippi River and out through New Orleans to international buyers. When Spain retroceded Louisiana to France under the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800, and when Spanish officials then suspended the American right of deposit at New Orleans in 1802, the economic pressure on the western settlements became acute, and the political pressure on Jefferson's administration followed immediately. Western settlers who felt cut off from their markets might seek their own arrangements with whatever European power controlled the river mouth. Those arrangements might not favor the seaboard governments that were supposed to represent them. The Mississippi question was not simply a commercial dispute. It carried a real risk to the territorial coherence of the young republic, and Jefferson understood it as such. James Monroe was dispatched to Paris in the spring of 1803 to reinforce the American negotiating position. He arrived to find that the French, through Napoleon's treasury official Barbé Marbois, had already indicated a willingness to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire territory. Napoleon had concluded that the failure of his Saint-Domingue expedition made Louisiana strategically indefensible and commercially purposeless, and that the renewed war with Britain, which would resume in May of 1803 following the collapse of the Peace of Amiens, required immediately liquid capital. The Americans needed the territory, Napoleon needed the cash. The alignment of interests was genuine, but the financial mechanism through which the transaction could actually be executed was the variable that neither government fully controlled, and the terms of that mechanism were not determined by the negotiators on either side. The scale of what was being contemplated in those Paris negotiations in April of 1803 was not lost on the participants. Livingston had arrived in France in 1801 without instructions to pursue anything larger than navigation rights and the purchase of the city of New Orleans. The shift to a territorial transaction of continental proportions happened with extraordinary speed, compressed into a matter of weeks, because the financial and strategic logic on the French side had already been worked out before the American commissioners were formally presented with the offer. Barbé Marbois moved the negotiation quickly because Napoleon had already decided, and because the mechanism to execute the financial transfer had already been identified. The American commissioners moved quickly because they understood that an offer of this magnitude, made under these conditions, was unlikely to survive delay. Monroe had not yet been formally received by the French government when the outline terms were already agreed. The speed of the negotiation, which the standard account presents as evidence of American diplomatic agility, reflected equally the fact that the banking houses capable of executing the transaction were already positioned and ready to move. The treaty signed in Paris on the 30th of April 1803 set the price at 60 million francs for the territory and 20 million francs in American commercial claims assumed from France, a total of 80 million francs, equivalent to approximately $15 million at the exchange rates then in use. The treaty's principal clauses established what was being sold and at what price. A separate financial convention, negotiated alongside the treaty, but receiving considerably less historical attention in the 2 centuries since, established how the payment would actually be structured. The United States would issue 6% government bonds, redeemable over 15 years, in the amount of $11,250,000. The remaining $3,750,000 would be settled through American commercial claims against France, dating from the quasi-war period. The bonds would be delivered to France. Napoleon's treasury, which required immediately usable capital and had no practical use for American paper carrying uncertain standing in European markets, would convert those bonds to cash by selling them to private buyers. The identity of those buyers had been established before the American negotiators completed the formal exchange of documents. The house that purchased the Louisiana bonds was Hope & Company of Amsterdam, one of the oldest and most powerful private banking firms in Europe, operating in direct coordination with Baring Brothers of London. The two firms had cooperated extensively on American sovereign debt operations since the 1790s, when they had participated in Dutch loan placements for the United States and worked together on earlier federal bond offerings that needed distribution in European markets. Hope & Company had maintained active financial relationships with the French Republic through the years of the Revolutionary Wars, operating from the commercially valuable position of a neutral intermediary with established access to parties on multiple sides of a sustained European conflict. That position had produced the institutional relationships with French treasury officials that the 1803 operation would require. Barbé Marbois himself, the French official who conducted most of the actual negotiation with the American commissioners, had extensive prior dealings with the Amsterdam banking community. The connection between the political terms being negotiated in Paris and the financial mechanism being assembled through Hope and Baring was not coincidental. Francis Baring, the founding senior partner of Baring Brothers, was among the most prominent figures in British financial life. He had served as a director of the East India Company, held a position on the board of the Bank of England, and maintained close personal and professional relationships with cabinet-level figures in successive British governments. His son Alexander sat in Parliament. The family's presence in British public life was not incidental to the firm's commercial capability. In a period when the boundary between private financial interest and state function was considerably more permeable than later institutional arrangements would suggest, political proximity was a form of operating infrastructure that could be deployed when transactions required official tolerance or official facilitation. The Louisiana transaction required exactly that. Britain and France were at war, or on the verge of resuming war, throughout the period in which the purchase was being negotiated. The British Navy controlled Atlantic shipping lanes. British investors purchasing bonds that had originated with the French government, routed through an American territorial transaction, were doing so with the knowledge that the British financial establishment had not obstructed the arrangement. Whether that reflected a calculation that it was preferable to redirect Napoleon's attention toward continental warfare rather than North American empire, or whether it reflected the degree to which the Baring network could operate across state boundaries the official record treated as absolute, the Louisiana transaction was possible only because British capital chose to participate. Alexander Baring traveled to the United States in 1802. The visit appears in most historical accounts as a private matter and a period of familiarization with the American commercial environment. During that visit, he met with Albert Gallatin, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, and held conversations with other figures in the American financial establishment, whose precise content is not fully documented in the publicly accessible record. What is documented is that by the time the Louisiana negotiations reached their critical closing phase in Paris in April of 1803, Hope and Company and Baring Brothers were already positioned to execute the financial transfer that the political transaction required. That positioning did not emerge from the Paris negotiations. It preceded them by months. The banking houses did not cause the Louisiana Purchase, but they were the financial architecture without which it could not have occurred in the form it took, on the timeline it required, or at the price France actually received. The specific terms on which Hope and Baring purchased the Louisiana bonds were not published in any government document contemporaneous with the treaty. Financial historians who have examined the relevant archives in London and Amsterdam have reconstructed the purchase price at approximately 87.5 cents on the dollar of face value, though some accounts place it marginally lower. The firms then placed those bonds with European investors, principally British and Dutch, at prices at or near par. The spread between the purchase price and the placement price represented an initial profit, captured within weeks of the transaction closing, that historians have estimated at between $1 million and $1.5 million. That figure accounts only for the placement margin on the initial transaction. The firms also retained their own positions in the bonds across the repayment period, received fees for their function as paying agents on the semi-annual interest distributions to bondholders, and derived the institutional benefit of having demonstrated at scale their unique capacity to execute sovereign transactions connecting the American government to European capital markets. The Louisiana operation was simultaneously a profitable trade and an institutional credential that would generate business for the following 3 decades. If this investigation is still with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more in the ledger than any single film can account for. Your attention is what makes it possible to keep pulling this forward. The American government was committed, from the moment the bonds were issued, to paying 6% annually on the $11 million face value, plus principal repayments on the agreed schedule across 15 years. The total interest cost to the United States on the Louisiana Purchase debt, calculated across the full repayment period, came to approximately $8 million above the principal. The transaction that every textbook presents as a $15 million purchase cost the United States closer to $23 million when the complete credit cost is included in the calculation. The margin above the nominal purchase price did not accrue to France. It accrued to the bondholders and to the institutions that had structured, placed, and serviced the instrument. France received approximately what the treaty specified. The additional cost was paid by American taxpayers across the following 15 years, to European investors who had never seen the Mississippi, who had no interest in the territory beyond the yield it generated on their capital, and whose names appear in none of the accounts that celebrate the Louisiana Purchase as a triumph of American statesmanship. The British position toward the Louisiana transaction deserves more careful attention than the standard account provides. In the spring and early summer of 1803, Britain and France were moving toward resumed war. The Peace of Amiens had been breaking down for months, and the formal resumption of hostilities came in May, weeks after the Louisiana Treaty was signed. Under those conditions, a transaction that channeled cash from European investors, a substantial proportion of them British, through an American territorial purchase into Napoleon's war treasury, was not a neutral event. It was a financial arrangement that crossed the front lines of an active conflict. The British government's tolerance of the Baring firm's role in placing the Louisiana bonds with British investors reflected either a strategic calculation that Napoleon's resources were better directed toward continental campaigning than North American empire, or a demonstration of the degree to which private financial networks could operate across state boundaries that official diplomatic discourse treated as absolute. The Baring family's political relationships in London were extensive. Francis Baring's connections extended to Pitt's Circle and to the financial officials of the Bank of England. The Louisiana bond placement was executed in the open, with British investors purchasing the bonds through established channels. The British government did not interfere. Whether that non-interference was passive or active, tacit or arranged, the record available in public archives does not resolve. What the record shows is that British capital participated in funding a transaction that delivered money to France at the moment Britain and France were at war, routed through a mechanism structured by a British banking house operating with full knowledge of the British financial establishment. The Napoleon who sold Louisiana in 1803 was not the Napoleon who had originally designed the North American Empire, of which Louisiana was meant to be the productive continental interior. The French imperial project in the Western Hemisphere rested on Saint-Domingue, the western third of Hispaniola, which by the 1790s had become the most productive colonial economy anywhere in the Atlantic world. The island generated approximately 40% of Europe's sugar supply and more than half of its coffee. The enslaved population that produced that wealth numbered close to 500,000 people. When Toussaint Louverture organized the resistance that became the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon dispatched an expedition of more than 40,000 soldiers under his brother-in-law General Leclerc to suppress it. Yellow fever accomplished what Haitian military resistance had not yet completed. By the close of 1802, France had lost the equivalent of an entire expeditionary army in Saint-Domingue. Leclerc died of the fever in November of that year. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana had no function in the French imperial architecture. There was no logic to maintaining a continental territory designed to supply a plantation economy that no longer existed. Napoleon's decision to sell was the conclusion of a strategic calculation, not an impulsive response to military setback. But the terms on which he sold, and the speed at which the financial structure was assembled around the political decision, reflected the acute urgency of his cash requirements as much as any territorial logic. The mechanics of what occurred in the months immediately after the treaty was signed reveal the degree to which the entire transaction operated on a schedule set by the banking houses rather than by either government. The Louisiana bonds were formally issued by the United States government and delivered to France. France, through its authorized agents, transferred those bonds to Hope & Company in Amsterdam. Hope & Company, working in coordination with Baring Brothers, organized the distribution of the bonds to investors in Britain, the Netherlands, and elsewhere in Europe. That distribution was not a slow or uncertain process. The bonds moved quickly because the placement had been prearranged and the investor base pre-identified. The infrastructure for distributing American government bonds in European markets already existed, assembled through the transactions of the previous decade. Hope and Baring had not built that infrastructure for the Louisiana transaction specifically. They had built it across years of prior business and were deploying it here in the most consequential application it had yet received. The question of where the bonds ultimately rested in the years of their repayment is relevant because it establishes who was receiving the interest payments that the United States Treasury sent out on every semi-annual distribution date across 15 years. American customs receipts collected from merchants importing European goods into American ports were converted into 6% interest payments and transmitted across the Atlantic to bondholders concentrated in Britain and the Netherlands. The fiscal infrastructure of the early American Republic was, through the mechanism of the Louisiana debt, channeling a portion of its revenue to European investors throughout the first decade and a half of the 19th century. That arrangement was legal, transparent in its formal structure, and entirely unexamined in the conventional account of the Louisiana Purchase as an act of American self-determination. The secondary market for the Louisiana bonds, once they were placed with investors, functioned normally. The bonds traded in London and Amsterdam at prices that reflected the market's assessment of American creditworthiness, which improved steadily as the United States demonstrated consistent payment behavior. By the time the bonds approached their maturity dates, they were trading at premiums to par, reflecting the established reliability of the American Treasury as a counterparty. That reliability itself was the long-term product of the financial discipline that Gallatin enforced across his tenure at the Treasury, a discipline that had the effect of increasing the value of the holdings that European investors had acquired at the discounted prices that Hope and Baring had paid to France in 1803. The investors who had purchased the bonds at or near par, having received them from Hope and Baring, realized yields that exceeded 6% when the discount at which the bonds had been acquired from France is factored into the full return on the transaction. The men who structured the instrument had designed it to produce exactly that outcome. The institutional consequence of the Louisiana transaction was not limited to the returns captured by Hope and Baring on the initial placement. The operation demonstrated, at a scale that European capital markets had not previously seen for American paper, that the United States government was capable of issuing and servicing substantial debt on reliable terms. That demonstration had a market value that was realized in every subsequent American bond operation in European markets. The spread at which American bonds traded over British consols narrowed in the years following the Louisiana placement. American state governments that came to market in the 1820s found European investors more receptive than their predecessors had been, partly because the Louisiana bonds had seasoned in European portfolios without incident. The Louisiana Purchase was the largest American sovereign debt operation of the early republic, and its successful execution in European markets established the credit baseline from which American expansion was subsequently funded. The American side of the record contains its own suppressions. Jefferson's constitutional anxiety about the purchase is documented at length in his correspondence and has been examined by historians in considerable detail. He believed with reasonable consistency that the federal government lacked the authority to acquire territory by treaty and drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase before concluding that political delay was more dangerous than doctrinal impurity. His correspondence on that question is part of the public record. What receives far less examination is the degree to which Jefferson and Gallatin understood the financial terms they were accepting and the fiscal constraints those terms would impose on the United States for the following 15 years. Gallatin's correspondence with the negotiators in Paris during the spring of 1803 makes clear that the Treasury had no realistic alternative to the bond structure that Hope and Baring were positioned to provide. A government that must borrow under conditions of urgency does not set the terms of its borrowing from a position of strength. The discount at which the Louisiana bonds were purchased from France, the interest rate they carried, the identity of the placement agents who would distribute them, and the geographic concentration of the resulting bond holding among European investors were all determined by the institutions supplying the capital, not by the government that required it. Gallatin understood the constraint. The Treasury papers document it without dwelling on it. The standard narrative of the Louisiana Purchase, which presents the transaction as a demonstration of American strategic confidence and diplomatic agency, does not engage with the degree to which the financial execution of the purchase was controlled by private institutions operating entirely outside American jurisdiction, on terms those institutions had positioned themselves to set before the negotiation began in earnest. The longer consequence of the Louisiana bond structure extended well beyond the repayment of the original debt. By the time the Louisiana bonds were retired in the late 18-teens and early 1820s, Hope and Baring had established themselves as the dominant placement agents for American government and state securities in European capital markets. The relationship that the Louisiana transaction created was not a single episode. It became the template through which American sovereign and quasi-sovereign borrowing was structured in European markets for the following generation. When the United States required emergency capital for the War of 1812, it returned to the same houses under conditions of even greater fiscal stress. When American states began issuing bonds to finance the canal and railroad construction that would integrate the interior economy through the 1820s and 30s, Baring Brothers handled the primary British placements for most of the largest issuances. The bonds of the Erie Canal, the securities of multiple state governments, and instruments connected to the Second Bank of the United States all passed through Baring at some stage of their placement. The house that had structured the bond financing of the Louisiana Purchase became, over the generation that followed, the primary institutional channel through which American continental expansion was funded in European capital markets. The Louisiana Purchase did not merely transfer territory, it established the credit relationship through which American expansion would be financed, on terms set in London and Amsterdam, by institutions whose names appear nowhere in the national mythology of westward growth. The land passed to the United States by treaty. The capital that made the treaty financially executable passed through private hands that set the price of their participation before either government had concluded what they were negotiating. The physical record of the Hope-Baring involvement in the Louisiana transaction is not sealed. The Baring Brothers archive is held at the Bank of England, where it is accessible to researchers. The Hope and Company records, substantially reduced by the upheavals of the 19th and 20th centuries but not destroyed, contain correspondence and account entries that document the bond placement and the terms of the purchase from France. Work by financial historians who have examined those materials has appeared in specialist publications on the history of Atlantic capital markets and American sovereign debt. That scholarship has not crossed into the general historical account of the Louisiana Purchase, which continues to be told as a story of diplomatic vision, presidential boldness, and fortunate timing. The bond structure that made the vision executable, and the institutions that designed it and profited from it, remain in footnotes the general account does not cite and the general reader does not encounter. Among the claims the United States assumed from France as part of the settlement were debts owed by France to American merchants for maritime seizures and commercial losses during the quasi-war of 1798 to 1800. Those claims, totaling approximately $3,750,000, were settled not in cash to the individual claimants, but in additional American bonds. Merchants who had been waiting years for restitution of losses incurred during a conflict that had ended 3 years earlier received paper rather than the cash settlement they had anticipated. Some of those claims had been purchased by financial intermediaries before the settlement terms were publicly announced. The identity of the buyers, the prices at which they acquired distressed merchant claims, and the return they realized when those claims were converted to par-value government bonds are calculations the available record permits. The standard account has not performed them. The record that the Hope and Baring archives contain has not been suppressed in the sense of being deliberately hidden from researchers. The Baring Brothers' papers at the Bank of England are catalogued and accessible. Historians of American finance and of the international bond market have examined them and published their findings in monographs and journal articles that any research library holds. What has been suppressed is not the documentary record, but the interpretive frame. The story of the Louisiana Purchase is told as a story of political decision-making, diplomatic negotiation, and territorial acquisition. It is not told as a story of credit, interest rates, bond placement, and the private institutions that were the indispensable financial precondition of the political result. That framing choice, repeated across 2 centuries of popular historical writing and embedded in the curricula of American schools, is itself a form of suppression more durable than any classified archive. A fact that is not sought is as effectively unavailable as a fact that is sealed. The Louisiana Purchase transformed the territorial scale of the United States in a way that no subsequent transaction matched. The political and strategic consequences of the acquisition are not in dispute and were enormous. What the financial record shows is that those consequences were purchased on terms set by private institutions operating across national boundaries, at a cost to the American Treasury substantially above the nominal price, through a mechanism that placed the actual funds in European hands before a single surveyor had crossed the Mississippi to measure what had been acquired. The land belonged to the Republic. The paper that paid for it belonged, for 15 years and in the secondary bond market long after, to the men who understood that a government without cash and a government that needs territory are 2 parties who will always reach agreement, and that the only variable that matters in any such agreement is who controls the financial instrument through which the agreement closes, who sets the terms of that instrument, and who collects the return it generates across the full period of its life. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the record. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.